Welcome to Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, continuing our talk about the lymphatic system. In this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about our body's third line of defense, or what we call the adaptive defense system. And this defense system is very specific. The other two types of defense systems we talked about are generalized defense systems that are set up to try to stop all foreign particles, foreign things that are trying to get inside our body. The third line defense, however, is very specific. This is almost like a special forces team that has a specific mission to kill a very specific target. And so we're going to look at the different parts of this system here. You can see the adaptive defense system here. First of all, we have lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cell. And there's two types. We have B lymphocytes and we have T lymphocytes. We'll talk about the differences about those in just a minute. And then one of their functions though is to produce antibodies. Antibodies, that's one of the things we think about when we talk about the immune system. And it's the lymphocytes that produce these antibodies, and we'll talk about how these antibodies are produced. And finally, we have the macrophages, which are also a type of white blood cell that we've seen before, and they're a part of this adaptive third system of defense that we have in our body to fight against foreign invaders. The macrophages are also part of the innate defense as well. We've already seen them there. There's three main aspects of the adaptive defense system. First of all, it's antigen specific. We'll talk more about what an antigen is specifically here in a minute, but the antigen is basically what is recognized by the immune system, and that's what we're fighting against. This is why it's specific, is because this system, we're looking at this specific antigen and fighting against that. Also, this system is systemic. When we talked about the cardiovascular system, we talked about how the cardiovascular system is systemic, meaning that it goes clear around the whole body. And so a systemic adaptive defense system means that if you're having an attack on one region, it's not just centralized to there, it's able to move around the whole body and protect your whole body. And then finally, a great part about this adaptive system is that it has a memory, meaning that once you've had an illness, you're not really likely to experience the effects of that illness again. Not that you won't come in contact with it again, but when you come in contact with an illness the second time, your body already has a system set up. It already recognizes that immediately, has these memory cells that recognize that, and your immune system goes into high speed, and it's able to knock out that pathogen or something like that. And so this is a great part about our adaptive defense system. Nice thing about the memory is that the second time around, it happens faster and stronger than it even did the first time. And so that's a very handy part of this. Let's talk about the different types of immunity, or the two parts of this system. We have the humoral immunity, humoral talking about the fluids of the body, and this is also known as antibody-mediated immunity. This is where the antibodies come in. The other type is cellular immunity, or cell-mediated immunity, and this type of immunity is targeting specific cells like virus, cancer, and foreign cells that are coming in grafts, such as skin grafts, but this could also be organ transplants, any sort of thing where we're having a foreign cell that's being presented into our body, and our body's going to recognize that and produce some sort of immune response to that. And that's why it's so hard for organ transplants, blood transfusion, and skin grafts and those sorts of procedures to work and be taken up by the body, because our body recognizes these foreign things. So now we need to talk a little bit about antigens and what those are, so we understand what exactly our body is trying to fight in all of these cases. So an antigen is any sort of substance that is going to cause our body to initiate an immune response in our body. And our body, this is very important because our body is able to recognize what is our own and what is not our own. And the way it does this is by the different types of molecules and proteins and things like that that we find on our body. And so this is how our cells, or how our immune system recognizes and fights off immunity, fights off foreign substances. Your body is able to recognize self versus non-self, and these antigens are what would be considered non-self. So part of the development of the immune system is being able to recognize things that are, recognize which proteins, amino acids, which molecules are made by your body, which cells are your body cells, and which are not. Antigens come in a lot of different types, and all of these antigens are going to excite the immune system and cause some sort of reaction, cause some sort of buildup of antibodies or whatever it may be. Foreign proteins, and these are the strongest type of antigens. Whenever your body comes in contact with foreign proteins, that's going to start an immune reaction. And this is important because bacteria and viruses, these are producing proteins that our body would not recognize. Nucleic acids, such as DNA, RNA. So we don't want foreign DNA and RNA running around. That's how viruses are able to take over our cells and fight our body, is through injecting DNA and RNA into our cells. And so our body really doesn't like foreign nucleic acids. Large carbohydrates. This comes in contact. We talked about blood type in this class already. And what happens in blood type is we have these carbohydrates on the outside of our blood cells that basically are the fingerprint of that cell. And so this is true of all cells. And so large carbohydrates, especially when they're on cells, help us recognize which are ours and which are not ours. And that's the basis of blood typing. Some lipids, fats, pollen grains, and also microorganisms. And microorganisms, of course, such as bacteria and viruses, they are antigens as well, and they have large carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and proteins that are sometimes on their cells. They're presented on the cell, or they're producing these as they're trying to take over our body. I guess this is maybe a good time to point out allergies as well. So before we get into the specifics of the immune system, but allergies are basically a breakdown, necessarily a break its job too well. So it's protecting us against things that we don't need protected against. So it's an overprotective form of the immune system. What's happening here is we're getting small molecules either in our, as we're breathing in pollen grains. In some cases, it may enter our circulatory system, like if you get a bite or something like that. But in general, these are going to be things that we inhale, and they link up with our proteins inside our body that are already present. And as they link up, suddenly our body no longer recognizes those proteins as our own, and so it builds up an immune response against these new, quote unquote, new antigens that are coming in contact with our body, and they're trying to fight against them. And so again, in the allergies, this is a situation when we don't want our immune system to be working, but it is. It's overprotective parent, basically. So that's a little bit about allergies and what's going on there. Now we want to look at the main cells that are functioning in the adaptive system. And the main ones are the lymphocytes. And there's two types of lymphocytes. We have B lymphocytes. And we also have T lymphocytes. Every lymphocyte, when we talked about the bone marrow and blood and white blood cell production, we talked about the fact that white blood cells are produced in the bone marrow, and lymphocytes are produced the same way, and all lymphocytes start out the same. So they're all produced in the bone marrow. They all are same initially, but then they differentiate into two different types of lymphocytes depending on where these lymphocytes mature. And so B cells and T cells are the two types that are produced this way. The B cells are called B cells because they mature in the bone. That's where they become the B lymphocytes. The T lymphocytes, on the other hand, they're going to mature and become part of the immune system in the thymus gland, which we've already talked about. maturation. And so that's where they get their name. And the B cells and the T cells, their job is a little bit different. And that's what we're going to look at next. Then we have the macrophages, which are the white blood cells that are going to help the lymphocytes as they go about doing their job. And this maturation process we have a special name for, and we call that immunocompetent. And again, this is just as the cells are becoming, as they're maturing. And B cells become immunocompetent in the bone. T cells become immunocompetent in the thymus. So now you know the two types of lymphocytes, the B cells and the T cells. The B cells are a part of the humoral response. So the B cells are a different part of the adaptive defense system than the T cells. B cells are humoral response carried out in the fluids of the blood, dealing with antibodies. The T cells are part of what we call the cell-mediated immune response. What we're going to do now is we're going to look first at the humoral response, what's happening there. Then we'll look at the cell-mediated response, and we'll talk a little bit about antibodies in this process as well. So first of all, the B lymphocytes. This is true of all lymphocytes, but these lymphocytes have receptors on the outside of their cells. And I'll show you an example what that means here in just a minute. But these receptors are on the outside of the cells, and what they do is they bind to these antigens. So antigens are flowing around in your blood, or they may be coming in your respiratory system, getting into the mucous lining, whatever it is. These antigens are getting into our body, and the B lymphocytes, the receptors, are recognizing that and binding to that. When they bind to an antigen, that activates the B cell, and it begins to proliferate. It begins to produce cells. And these cells we call clones because they're exact copies of each other. The interesting thing about lymphocytes is that every lymphocyte is specific to one antigen. One lymphocyte per one antigen. Meaning that, say that you get a flu virus in your body. There's one lymphocyte, one type of lymphocyte cell, or one lymphocyte cell in your body that will recognize that flu virus. If you get a different flu virus, that same lymphocyte can't recognize the other flu virus. It has to be a different lymphocyte. So basically, as our immune system is being produced, as these lymphocytes are being produced, our body is producing a wide variety of lymphocytes, and they're going around our body looking for these antigens. Depending on the antigens we come in contact with, that's going to activate a certain lymphocyte, and it's going to start proliferating. If a lymphocyte never comes in contact with the antigen that it is specific to, then it's never going to be activated. And then there's a lot of lymphocytes that never will be. In our whole life, they'll never be activated once. And that's okay. They're just there just in case. And so another interesting thing is it depends on our genetics. So our genetics are what determine the lymphocytes that we produce. And so every person has a specific number of antigens that it can recognize and produce a response to. And there's a lot. It's not like it's a small number. Our body is able to recognize, I don't even know a number, millions of different antigens that we'll come in contact with throughout our life. And so it's amazing. It's an amazing way that our immune system has evolved and developed is this example of how it's able to recognize these antigens. But this is important. It's very specific, one lymphocyte to one antigen. And this is why this is the specific system, is because of this relationship here between the one lymphocyte and the one antigen. So what happens here is as these B cells are activated, they start to reproduce. Most of them become what we call plasma cells. And these plasma cells have a job to do, and that is to produce antibodies. So antibodies, again, these are proteins. They're produced in the cells. As these B cells are activated, they start producing these antibodies. These antibodies are going to recognize the same antigen that original B cell recognized. And so these B cells, these plasma cells begin producing these antibodies. They put it out into the blood, and that's why this is called the humoral response. These B lymphocytes, these antibodies move out into the blood, and in the blood they can come in contact with these antigens that are going to bind to those antigens. And that's how this part of the immune system is able to recognize and shut down these foreign antigens that we're coming in contact with. This activity lasts for about 4 to 5 days, and then it starts to ramp down. The majority of the antibodies, or the peak of the antibody production, is about 10 days after we've come in contact with some sort of antigen, and it slowly begins to ramp down as we're able to fight off and get rid of that infection. Some of the B cells become memory cells. So we have these two pathways here, either plasma cells or memory cells. These memory cells are important in this, what we call the secondary response. The next time we come in contact with next time we come in contact with that same exact antigen, these memory cells are already there, they're already active, come in contact with that antigen, they begin proliferating immediately and produce tons of antibodies, and that's why the second time we come in contact with the same antigen, it doesn't affect us, and we get rid of it a lot quicker than the first time. This slide mentions a little bit about this secondary response. These memory cells they have different lifespans, but they can hang around for a long time, depending on the memory cell. Some may hang around for years, some not as long, but they're there, and they're there to protect us from the second exposure. If we do get exposed again, we have very rapid response, and the secondary response is stronger and longer lasting than that first response was. Let's now watch a little video about how this humoral immunity works with the B cells.
Humoral immunity, carried out mainly by B cells, deals with invaders in body fluids. B cells are lymphocytes that send out antibody molecules in response to certain stimuli. There are many kinds of B cells. Each kind produces and presents its own uniquely shaped antibody receptors in its plasma membrane. These unique receptors only bind to antigens with specific shapes.
So let's stop here for a minute, and you can see here, these are the antigens. So here's our cell, these are our B cells. These are not the antigens, these are the receptors that are produced by the B cells that are going to bind with the antigens. These orange little diamonds up here, these are representing some sort of antigen. Again, it can be any sort of molecule, a protein, a nucleic acid, whatever it might be, a bacteria. These receptors here are going to be able to recognize this antigen. Notice how all these receptors are different. Every B cell has a different receptor. Only one of these B cells is going to be able to bind to that specific antigen.
The B cell that successfully binds to an antigen is stimulated to proliferate into a clone of cells with the same specificity. This process of antigen-selected proliferation is known as clonal selection. B cell proliferation produces clones of plasma cells and memory cells. Memory cells are long-lived cells that can respond rapidly to future exposures to the same antigen. They account for the speed and strength of the secondary immune response that gives us long-term immunity to a disease. Plasma cells multiply rapidly. They produce and secrete antibodies in increasing amounts, peaking about 2 weeks after the activation of the original B cell. These antibodies flow through the body's fluids and tag the original foreign antigen molecules, marking them for destruction. The main role of antibodies secreted.
Okay, let's stop there with the animation for now. We'll talk a little bit more about antibodies in the next section. In the last few seconds of this, or maybe minute or so of this part of the lecture, let's talk about the primary versus secondary response. This is a nice little flow chart that shows how our body is going to react to certain disease or certain antigen. What it's showing here, let's say that at time 0, this is when your body comes in contact with that antigen, whether it's you're breathing it in, you're getting it, you just caught the flu. Let's say you just came in contact with somebody that has the flu, and so now you've caught the flu. You have this little lapse time that happens as your body waits for that B lymphocyte that recognizes that antigen to bind to that antigen. And so this is where you're going to start showing the symptoms of the flu, and then once that B lymphocyte is activated, it's going to start producing it's going to start proliferating, producing the plasma cells and the memory cells. And these these plasma cells will then produce the antibodies. And now you see your response here. So your body's producing these antibodies, sending them out into the blood. And there you go. You were able to fight the flu off. And then hopefully after about a week, so notice this is in weeks here. So hopefully you don't have it much longer than 1 to 2 weeks. Finally, you're getting over this infection. Notice how over the course of the next few weeks, the antibodies start to disappear. So all in all, this primary response took about 4 weeks for it to first recognize the antigen, to ramp up after about the first week, and then to wind down. By the end of 4 weeks, your antibodies are pretty much gone. But you produce memory cells as well, these B lymphocytes that are memory cells. So let's say that you come in contact with the antigen again. Notice this secondary response. These memory cells are already present. They immediately recognize that antigen, and they start proliferating, produce these plasma cells. And so within just a matter of days, as opposed to a week, suddenly you've got this huge response. But notice the difference. This initial response was this big. The secondary response is much bigger, much faster, and longer lasting as well. So notice the decline isn't as fast. And so in this case, notice this little lag time here, you were experiencing the symptoms of this flu. You weren't feeling very good during this time as your body's ramping up and fighting off the flu. The second time, you may not even know that you came in contact with that flu virus because the antibodies come into play so quickly that you don't even have time to recognize that. And so this is how the secondary response works. It's very interesting. We also have this thing about a little bit about immunity, about acquiring immunity. We talk about being immune to a certain disease, and this deals with this idea of antibodies. And so we can become immune. So once we've had that flu, for example, we are then immune to that same flu virus. We're not going to get the same type of flu twice in our lives. And this immunity comes about by a few different ways. First of all, we have what's called naturally acquired, and this is what we've been talking about so far. This is where our body is actively coming in contact with that, producing the antibodies and fighting off the infection. And this is a way to become immune to a disease. Once you've had it, you're good to go. Once you've overcome that disease, you have the antibodies present. You can also have naturally acquired passive immunity. Passive meaning that your body's not actively producing the antibodies, but you're getting the antibodies from somewhere else. And this, one of the main places this happens is the young infants, babies, after they're born, they actually get antibodies through the breast milk as they're feeding. And this is one of the reasons that there's a push for breastfeeding babies as opposed to bottle feeding, because they're not going to get those antibodies from the mother in the bottle feeding where they will in the breastfeeding. Because if the mom's fighting any sort of infection, she's going to be building up antibodies against it. She comes in contact with antigens. She can then pass that on to her children, and so onto her baby through the breast milk and also through the placenta, so that her baby has this natural but passive immunity. However, all she is giving the baby, him or her, is the antibodies, and so this is not long lasting. It's not like the active immunity where we have the memory cells. The passive immunity is only going to last as long as those antibodies last, and as they're broken down in the body, the baby's no longer going to be immune. So this type of immunity only lasts as long as the breastfeeding is going on. We also have vaccines that we're familiar with, and this is another way to get immunity, but it's artificial. And what we're doing in this case is we're artificially stimulating the immune system. So when you get a vaccine, in the shot they're giving you a taste of the antigen. Usually, sometimes it's a dead virus, sometimes it's just a very small bit of the live virus, so that your body produces an immune response, and then you produce memory cells. So then later in life, when you come in contact with that, then you already have this response system, and you're not going to catch the disease. This is why sometimes you can become sick from something like a flu vaccine or a flu shot. When you go in to get the flu shot, your body is actively fighting against that. Sometimes it can kind of start to cause some of the symptoms of flu before your body's able to effectively shut it down. But this is this is a great way that we've been able to prime our bodies against things like polio, smallpox, and they've basically been eliminated from human infection, which is an amazing thing. There's also, last of all, there's something called passive, artificially acquired passive immunity, and this is when you're injected with what we call immune serum, which is basically you're injected with antibody-like material that's just going to fight off an infection, but only as long as those antibodies last. You're not producing memory cells. Here you are again producing memory cells in the active vaccine, so that later you'll be able to fight it off again. In the passive injection, this only lasts as long as those antibodies do. So I went a little bit longer than I wanted to on this lecture, but that covers the humoral response of the adaptive immune response. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the cell-mediated response.